Good morning, everybody. Welcome to meeting 3 of the Special Committee on Governance. Welcome to the members of the committee and everyone else coming to visit us. I'm going to take a quick moment at the start just to make an announcement. On the side table are extra copies of the workbook, which is part of our consultation process. We had one last night in Etobicoke. I attended that, and I was really lucky to hear some of the feedback and information that came forth from the public. But I wanted to take a quick moment to announce the next 4, just so everybody knows they're coming. We have Wednesday, June 12th at the Scarborough Civic Center in the Rotunda, 150 Borough Drive. It starts at 6 p.m. We have Thursday, June 13th, 2019, at the North York Civic Center in the Burgundy Room, 5100 Yonge Street. That also starts at 6 o'clock. We have Saturday, June 15th, at Metro Hall in rooms 308 and 309. That is 1 to 2 p.m. for the open house and 2 to 4 p.m. for the discussion. And finally, we have North Toronto Memorial Community Centre on Monday, June 17th, 200 Eglinton Avenue. 6 to 7 p.m. is the open house, and 7 to 9 p.m. is the discussion. For those in the room with us, the screen at the back of the room provides real-time updates concerning where we are in the agenda and what's coming next. You can follow the agenda and debate on your computer, tablet, or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. We acknowledge the land that we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Seeing none, may I have a motion to confirm the minutes of the April 12th, 2019 meeting? Councillor Perks, all those in favor, and that is carried. I'll now go through the agenda. There are 2 items. The first item, GV 3.1, the complexities of city governance. We have a guest speaker, Professor Pamela Robinson, and so that will be held. And GV 3.2, business improvement areas and community programs, response to information requests. We have 2 presentations from city staff. One from the Manager of Business Improvement Areas Office and the Director of Community Resources, SDFA. And we will come to that second, so that's being held. So on to the first item. I'd like to welcome Professor Robinson. Thank you for coming to speak to us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, I'm a registered professional planner, and I teach at the Ryerson School of Urban and Regional Planning. I was invited today to come talk about what I'm framing as the complexities of city governance. I'm a Toronto resident. So I live in Councillor Perks' ward. Anything I say is not his fault, so don't blame him. And what I want to talk about today is I've, like everyone else in the city, have been wrestling with all of the change that's both been imposed upon us, the change that we've welcomed, and the change that's imminent through things like climate change and broader economic forces. And so the thing that I'm going to focus on is just how do we start thinking about how to wrestle with change. And one of the challenges is that change is coming at us rapidly and quickly, and it feels like we're reacting to it. And so what I'm going to talk about is trying to think ahead about being ready for change. This is a picture. I walk the same route in High Park every morning with my dog, and I'm always struck by how lucky I am to have a beautiful dog walk, but also how ironic this very calm picture is in contrast to people's everyday lives in the city of Toronto. This picture is beautiful and it's calm and it's bucolic, but most people's lives are a bit more turbulent than this. People are challenged to find affordable places to live, to have access to fresh and healthy food. People's path from home to work or school is challenging sometimes. We've all got mobility issues that we're wrestling with, and so I want to focus on the contrast between the things that are calm and the things that are turbulent. And the question that I want to ask is, in a rapidly changing city, are we focusing on the right things? And before I want to jump in, I just want to say, You don't know really who I am. I'm a person who fundamentally believes in City Hall. I have deep respect for city staff and for councilors and for the democratic process. And so please don't listen to this as an effort to kind of shrink government or privatize things. That's not what this is about. This is just about rethinking some of the ways in which we do things. And the thing that I'm going to focus on is something that's really familiar to me. I'm going to focus on committee of adjustment and the planning process, because as a planner, this is something that I work with. And I'm going to use an example from literally my own backyard and ask the question, what if I want to build a shed instead of a snowman in my backyard? What's the process and how does it work? And so you can see I live in a narrow little, I have a 14-foot wide yard, and if I want to build a shed that fits inside my backyard with a zoning bylaw, no problem, I can go and do that. But what if the shed that I want to build is a little bit bigger? What do I have to do? Well, I need to go to the committee of adjustment. And there are lots of steps in the Committee of Adjustment, and the steps in the Committee of Adjustment involve both time and resources. Individuals, people's time, but also city staff's time, and also resources, mine as a homeowner, but the City of Toronto's, and I just want to walk through them. So, the first thing you have to do if you want to build a bigger shed is you have to read and understand the zoning bylaw. And one of the things that my profession has gotten really good at is writing really complicated policies that most normal people don't understand. And so if you're an ordinary homeowner, you may need help. Luckily, the folks at the permit desk downstairs are really good at helping, but you still may need to get some expert help. If you want to submit something to the Committee of Adjustment, you're going to need to submit plans. That involves going in and using the fees and the services of a professional like an architect or a builder, and you may need to get a municipal survey too, so there's more money and more time. And then you need to apply, and that takes time, and there's also a fee to apply. And a Committee of Adjustment fee for something pretty basic runs about $1,600 right now. And then you wait until your plans can be heard, and then you have your Committee of Adjustment hearing, and that means you go, and sometimes you go by yourself and you make your pitch, or sometimes you take an architect or a builder with you, which also costs time and money. And then you wait again because the decision is taken, but then there has to be an appeal. And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no, and then maybe there's an appeal or maybe there isn't. And then if there's an appeal, then there's the Toronto Local Appeal Board that hears your work too. And so if you look at all the sums of these steps to put a shed in your backyard, what we see is that we've got a significant investment of people's time and money, both inside City Hall, but also in the community. And I think it's really important to ask the question, is this the way we really want to be spending our time and our money inside City Hall? Are these the kinds of things that we really want to focus on? And if we had to start all over again, if we wanted to build a process that would allow people to make small changes in their neighborhoods or in the ways in which they live, would we actually invent the Committee of Adjustment process? And I think it's a really important question to think about, not to attack Committee of Adjustment, but just in general, because the process itself is labor-intensive, it's resource-intensive, but it also conveys a particular amount of certainty about the way in which we live. And I think this is one of the interesting challenges that we face in Toronto right now, which is if we want to live in a city that's going to be vibrant and dynamic and welcoming and inclusive and ecologically sustainable, but also is Canada's largest growing city, we need to accept the fact that we're wrestling with a certain amount of change, and we need to have a change or a growth mindset. And if you think about that mindset and you think about Committee of Adjustment, we've got this interesting contrast. If you want to build a slightly bigger shed, you have to go through all of those steps. And what that says, I think, to people is everything's going to be just so, and that we want to exert a certain amount of control over things that are pretty small. And I think in a time of change right now, in a city like ours, we should be thinking about, do we really want things to be just so like that all of the time? Do we want to create a process in which we actually find a way to be resilient and responsive to change that doesn't necessarily require steps that look like this? And so it's an interesting proposition, I think, if we think about if we were going to start all over again. Because what is the Committee of Adjustment? The Committee of Adjustment's really there as a governance process that helps people manage change inside their neighborhoods. But one of the things that it presumes from its very nature is that there's probably going to be a problem, or there's going to be conflict between people. And if we were going to start all over again and imagine it, would we start with the four tests of a minor variance, that it's consistent with the zoning bylaw, consistent with the official plan, that it's consistent with the character of the neyborhood, and that it's actually minor in nature? I'm not sure. Maybe the question we would start with is the change that you want to make in your backyard okay for your backyard and also acceptable for your neighbors? And if everybody was in agreement then maybe you could just go ahead and do it without having to go through all of these steps and using all of these City Hall resources and all of this City Hall time. And you might be able to just do it. And so I think it's an interesting thing to think about in a city like ours, because in this time of change and in this sea of turbulence that we're facing, one of the things that you have control over inside City Hall are the things that you're already doing. And if you wanted to think about how could we work differently or how could we work better, you could start to think about maybe redirecting the resources you have in a way that was different. And so when we think about what might the future hold, and we think about the changing nature of the City of Toronto, I think we need to think about what kinds of actions do we need to take in terms of governance. The narrative of Toronto is one that we're a city of change, and I think one of the things that we talk about in our planning school with our students is how do we get people ready for change? How do we get people to think about the fact that if you're going to be part of the City of Toronto and all of the amazing things that we have, what does it mean to be ready and adaptive to change? And change lands in different ways with different people. And some people's ability to respond to change is much easier than others. So the more money you have and the weller you are and the more physically capable you are, the more resistant or resilient you are to change. If you're from a vulnerable or an equity-seeking community, change may be harder for you. And so we need to think about who are we as a city? What kinds of conversations are we having about change? Have we had a conversation about who we are together as the City of Toronto? I've lived here since amalgamation. I came to Toronto just before amalgamation started, and one of the things that's interesting to me is that people still talk about the old constituent communities that they came from. They still say, I'm from Etobicoke or I'm from Scarborough. We talk about Toronto as a city of neighborhoods, and I love my neighborhood. I live on the border of a bunch of neighborhoods and I identify with all of them. And the story of neighborhoods and the stories of our old communities are really important. But do we have a collective sense of who we all are together? How are we going to have conversations about mobility? How are we going to have conversations about affordable housing and infrastructure investments if we don't collectively understand who we all are together? And who we all are together is a story of change. And so if we're hanging on to the Toronto of 25 years ago, we're keeping ourselves, I think, from moving forward and thinking in a productive and a creative way about how that change might land. And so if we're going to be a city that's narrative is about a story of change, I think we need to start thinking about how do we build governance models that both respond to change but also keep change active and mindful in people's democratic thinking so that we're better able to convene the conversations we need and the decisions that we need to take to allow that change to unfold. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Robinson. Were there any questions from the committee? I will, so Carol, you want me to go and maybe be? Yeah, go ahead. Okay, I had a couple. The first was Committee of Adjustment. I mean, every councillor is going to be really familiar with this. I just wondered if you had advice as a planner and as an academic and as somebody that's watching the system, how we walk the fine line of separating politics from planning, because they're two different things and people's perspectives are different on what they mean.
Yeah, I could appreciate that. I also served on Committee of Adjustment in Kingston, which was, I remember the first time I went to a Committee of Adjustment training session, I remember thinking, this is why people don't like local government, right? Because we were focusing on really complicated things. I think the politics piece is the part that makes all of your constituency office people pull out their hair. And so I think the planning piece, the way planners can help, I think, is to try to think about a new way of defining how small changes in neighborhoods could actually be enacted, which would reduce the politics piece. And we have bigger examples. I'll use the example of King Street East and King Street West. When Barbara Hall was mayor, there was this big planning experiment where they changed the way the zoning worked in both of those neighborhoods to be slightly more permissive. Instead of saying you can't do these things, the way the code was rewritten was basically to say, as long as the things you want to do fit inside these performance parameters, or as long as the sites work in a particular way, you've got a bit more freedom to move. If we brought a similar approach to thinking about smaller scale planning, maybe we'd have similar success, which was the default, the starting point of designing the new system might be something like, small changes are okay as long as everyone's on board. And this is where the politics piece comes in. So you'd need a process in place to help make sure that people sorted that everybody was on board in a way that was fair. What you wouldn't want is the bully neighbor going and twisting the arm of everybody else, forcing someone to sign off to say, my ginormous shed is okay in my backyard. You'd have to find a process that was democratic and fair and transparent. But if you started with making small amounts of change okay within reason, maybe we could start to move our way to a different process. But that would also, I think, have to be part of a bigger civic conversation about how is our neighborhood going, how are things doing, what kinds of changes might people want to make, and people would need to have a bit of time to get their heads around how the change might unfold over time. At the end of the day, you know, the people who are elected officials are ultimately the ones who have to make the hard decisions. But I think it would be fantastic if over time we could reduce the amount of friction about small things that weren't necessarily so significant and try to divert your good brains and attention to the things that mattered more. At the end of the day, it won't be perfect, but I think given the complexity of the things that we need to wrestle with as a city, it's a good time to think about reducing the amount of time and energy spent on smaller things and trying to focus on bigger things.
Okay, I had a follow-up one. One of the things that I had learned in my journey as becoming a councillor, I had to learn very quickly about this matrix, or this, it's almost like a quadrangle. There's 4 pieces to it. The first is the tribunal, or the council, or the councillors, or whoever the decision-making body is. The second is the city staff, who are performing a secretariat function, but they also may be providing advice or reports that inform that.
Right.
The third may be the applicant, or the person that's going before the tribunal. And the last would be the public that comes and deputes. And the missing piece in there is what was described to me as the silent majority. And that's in recognition that the vast, vast majority of people in a decision often don't get involved in the participation or speak up. And one person had told me, you know, in some ways that's supported by the role of staff. They'll give you an opinion or something based on policy. And in that way, the silent majority is protected or is balanced out in the process, because those that speak and the applicant may have differing interests from the silent majority. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how the position of the silent majority could continue to be strengthened or risks taken away in these processes.
Yeah, it's such a good question, Councillor Halliday. Thank you. You know, we, as people who convene public meetings all the time, you know, we always ask the question as planners, who's missing from the room? And then the question is, well, why aren't they there? You know, are they not there because we didn't convene the meeting around something that they cared about? Was the meeting badly timed? Are their lives too complicated? Are they not coming because they don't feel like they're going to make a difference? Like, these are the things that I suspect your staff think about all the time. That's what I think about as a planner, and we teach our students to think about too. I think the silent majority could also be kind of reframed as just the broad public consensus. And I think the way you know what the broad public consensus looks like is that you have a city government, including the 4 quadrants of staff, councillors, staff, and people who are deputing. You're out there talking to people all the time. I mean, your individual offices, your people who answer the phones, the folks at Toronto 311, they have an amazing sense of the things that matter to people, right? Because they're out in the field. And so I think a responsive city government is in active conversation with its public about the things that matter, and that you're constantly checking in with the people who were the closest. And sometimes those people who are the closest are, you know, the folks who check people's wristbands at the public swimming pool. You know, one of the great things about the reach of the City of Toronto, and I would add its agencies, including Toronto Public Library, where you've got, you know, staff in 100 parts of Toronto, is that they've got great reach. And so you want to take advantage of that information and access and try to make sure that it's feeding into the process. It wouldn't be on something like someone's shed in their backyard, but on bigger matters of civic importance, trying to harness the power of that reach is really important.
Thank you. Did any members of the committee wish to ask? Councillor Carroll?
Well, I'm hesitating because I don't know if what I have is a question or an argument. We're not supposed to argue.
Let's go.
I'm also frustrated by the fact that I didn't see the beginning of the presentation. I'm open to looking at changes in how we have a committee of adjustment, but Where I struggle is not having one at all, or fundamentally changing the fact that we have this body that is not made up of elected politicians, that has to determine the first thing: is it minor? Is this minor or not? And I like the idea that that decision is made by someone who is not one of my colleagues. All of the present company accepted, but there have been politicians through the ages whose stock and trade is treating nothing as if it's minor and making a giant explosion out of everything, no matter how minor, to endear their electorate to them. And so I like the fact that a non-elected official makes that determination. We're going to need a body to do that. If we want to treat something as minor and just give it some parameters, who asks that first question and then answers it? That's the one thing, maybe only the only one thing that I like about Committee of Adjustment. And so if we change it, at the end of the day, it has one high-stakes question that it's got to answer.
So, Councillor Carl, just, I used it, thank you for your question and argument, Ish. I was using it as an example of something familiar, but as a way of rethinking just, it uses a lot of time and energy, and given what's coming and the complexity of the work you have to do, the question was just, I used Committee of Adjustment as an example. But I'm going to pick up on what you said. So, you know, this question of do we need a Committee of Adjustment at all, one of the things that's really interesting is, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not sure anyone's actually ever studied the impact of Committee of Adjustment as a research project, which is a really weird and, like, I don't think, and I think part of it is that there's this funny gap between academics and planning practice. I think most professors don't actually know that much about Committee of Adjustments. They wouldn't study it. But for a longstanding, durable part of local government, I've never yet seen a proper research study about the impact. So if we were going to proceed, and I don't want to, like, but it would be really interesting, for example, to map all of the minor variances in the city of Toronto and start to differentiate where they are and what they did, but also to look at how much time and how many resources went into things like sheds and decks and porches and things like that. I mean, the challenge with a minor variance, not to get too technical, is that developers can use it to get 3 stories on a building. That happened across the street from me, or, you know, we were at Committee of Adjustment as a household asking for an extension to our house. We got it, but that's a technical planning thing, but we've never really studied it. But I think, you know, the city did do something really interesting relatively recently, which was when you invented the T-Lab, you said, look, we need to think about a new way of handling dispute resolution related to things in the Committee of Adjustment. And I had the amazing privilege of actually serving as the chair of the nominating panel for that process. So I got an inside peek into the kinds of folks who wanted to step up and serve and participate in that process. And I was really struck by first of all, the amount of civic goodwill and desire to serve, but also the integrity of the people who've agreed to participate. And so there's a really good example, I think, of taking a step back and rethinking the city's intervention in these kinds of processes. So, but the kinds of questions that you asked about who should make the decision and are we asking the right questions are the kinds of things I'm advocating for at this particular juncture in the road, which is we should really take an inventory of the things we're doing. And a lot of them are artifacts of an entirely different city. I mean, Committee of Adjustment's been around a long time, and every community in Ontario has one. So, but is it the right artifact for the city we have, but also the city that we're going to be moving forward is the broader question that I would ask.
So just one other question, because, you know, we do have partnerships and agreements around studies. A study of Committee of Adjustment, its impact, and even the community's feelings about it, I'd love that study because I think it might help us bring some environmental policy to the monster house syndrome that is happening out where I represent. But would that be a valuable exercise? Could we sort of have an affordable Committee of Adjustment research because it would be valuable to planning students as well? That sounds like an excellent exercise.
It would be an amazing exercise. And I'm going to go back. I'm going to look at Meg Shields. A long time ago in 1998, we had the Sustainability Roundtable model where I was,
You both attended as teens.
yeah, where we had city staff. I happen to be the faculty member, and Beth Savin, who some of you may know, was also involved. But we had city staff working directly with students on small research projects based in City Hall. In Vancouver, there's a model called City Studio, where you've got students and faculty working inside on applied research projects. And so there would be all kinds of really interesting ways. We've got 3 schools of planning in Toronto. I think we could mobilize something. It would be a different way of working, and it wouldn't be a procurement thing. It would be a hands-on inside thing. But I think we could probably do something that would be both great for training young planners, that would be interesting for staff and city residents. I've got Gabe, are you still behind me? Gabe Edelman's here from U of T. He's got a governance lab. I think a number of people could collaborate and do something really interesting on that.
Any other questions from the committee? Councillor Perks.
So following along, you've taken an example of a city process which is highly technical and means that you come down here instead of having a conversation in the neighborhood.
Right.
Is that? So there are, as you said, there are dozens of things like that where we've developed some mechanism. There's designing a playground, right? And we have a mechanism. We bring in an outside designer on a contract. They put up 3 options, which they've already decided are the only 3 options. People who know nothing about the cost of park equipment or how budgeting works are told, do you like, the yellow one, the orange one, or the green one, and they pick one. So what I'm curious about is what tools or models can you use so that it's not one of these closed, front-facing, centralized, pre-digested processes? What's out there?
So I don't know entirely that it exists like that, but that doesn't mean, but you could make one. Because the City of Toronto has purpose-built all kinds of really interesting civic tools. I think all of these, so the example of the playground is really interesting because that's like pretty traditional consultation, right? There's a dog and pony show. It's like pick one of 3. In a better world, there would have been an ongoing conversation about what's our parks and open space look like in our neighborhood? What are the resources available? I would argue that, the conversation might be, do we want to take those resources and put them in our parkette, or do we want to reach across the ward boundary and team up with a couple of other wards and put our money together and build something maybe that's more robust, that's more centrally located? When we only invite the public in that late in the process, we lose the chance to think differently about the way in which we work. But for that kind of thinking to work, you need an active and ongoing conversation about the future in the city that's vibrant and dynamic, and that takes resources and time, and I'm not proposing at all that that's easy, but it would be a fundamental shift in the way in which we work. A practical example, I was thinking about this on my bike ride in this morning. I was thinking about what are things that we routinely do that are just built into our everyday lives, and I was thinking about changing the batteries in your smoke detector, right? We know that when the clocks change in the spring and in the fall, you're supposed to check the batteries in your smoke detector. Well, what's the civic engagement equivalent of that? When do we routinely check in and have conversations? I lived outside Canada for a year, and in our tiny village, the mayor used to do a levee on New Year's Day. And the mayor would come and talk about the year that was to come, and people came and they drank wine, and it was really fun, and it was a big celebration, and it lasted a long time, but it was part of people's civic habit, right? They came to expect it, but it was also fun and it was interesting. And so I think part of it is about, it's an ongoing conversation about smaller things and bigger things, but it needs to be built in, and it needs to be regular, but we can't pretend like it won't be resource intensive, because to do it well, it needs to be distributed, but it also has to be more than just, there's a small local piece, but there's a bigger conversation about the city as a whole too, right? And what's the direction that we're going to go through together? Because we can't have a conversation about affordable housing or about public transportation if people don't understand other parts of the city. And I think part of the bigger scale civic conversation is about trying to find ways to get people to go and interact. And I think about Doors Open Toronto as a really good example of May 25th every year, things open up and people go and visit. So we know that that curiosity exists. Well, how do we extend that kind of curiosity to help people understand who we are as Toronto as a whole? And I don't know what your opinions are, but do you think we collectively understand ourselves as a new, bigger city? I'm not so sure we do. And so I think that's the companion piece to the smaller scale pieces. There needs to be a big conversation too, but it needs to be routine and it needs to be expected, and people need to be in the habit of thinking that way, I think. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions from the committee members? Seeing none. Thank you, Professor Robinson, for coming to speak to us today.
Thanks so much.
The clerks have advised me that there are no additional speakers registered, and I'll take a moment to ask if there's any members of the public visiting us that wish to speak on this item. Seeing none, are there any members of the committee that wish to speak on the item? Councillor Perks?
So I think there's an interesting challenge in the conversation we've just had. Right now, frankly, the only formal citywide civic engagement that we do is once every 4 years they get to pick who's here. And that's not the conversation, right? That's not the regular routine civic engagement that we want. And what I'm curious about, and I guess I put this as a challenge to all of us and to city staff and members of the public who are watching, is how do we routinize the conversation? So yeah, it doesn't just happen when you're mad about the pothole on your street, but it's part of, like changing your batteries. How do we change the batteries civically in a routine and routine way that is an actually broad conversation, not a narrow one, not one I want to be careful about what word that I use here, that's dominated by the same group of people all the time. And I don't know the answer to that question. I know that having a city councillor who's supposed to represent 110,000 people isn't the way to do it. So I'm curious about that, and I want to thank I want to thank you, Pamela, for helping to open that question.
Thank you, Councillor Perks. Councillor Carroll.
I'm wondering what speaking of governance, what the governance is of what we do with what we just heard. I love the idea of the Committee of Adjustment study. So a whole bunch of people aren't deliriously happy with it, and sometimes it's not even bureaucratic reasons. Sometimes it's there's a broad community opinion that they're regularly making the wrong decision. And I use the example of the monster house phenomenon that is distinctly suburban, but I'll bet my colleague and I have that in common in one subdivision or another. Under my new boundaries, I have it in every subdivision. If there isn't an apartment building, the monster house phenomenon is a problem. And there's really no environmental wraparound. We're building environmentally sustainable and responsible large buildings because we apply our policies to those. But we're also letting individual owners build things that are just going to be terrible, awful, unaffordable dinosaurs in about 20 years. And that never gets discussed. So there is a disconnect to what the city's goals are and the flexible parameters that we have set in Committee of Adjustment. And studying where we're at and how people feel about that and how they feel about the process sounds like a great idea. But do we move right now that we want to hear back on that? Or do we assume it's an undertaking, having these presentations where later on going to get hard recommendations? What's the process?
I guess we'll deviate from the process. Councillor Carroll, I had given some thought to this as well because I had been inspired by some of the discussion on Committee of Adjustment, and I'll speak about that in a moment, but I know that as a committee we can bring motions forward on things that we wish to focus on. We do have a couple of meetings left, and the one thing that I had learned through this process in working with city staff was the committee doesn't have to solve it. So one of the final outcomes of the committee could be pardon me, to do an undertaking to have a deeper dive into the Committee of Adjustment. And that could be our recommendation to council at the end of this process. or one of our recommendations to council, that we go further and perhaps do a study of the committee adjustment or processes in general. And so a motion now could be an option. I think you've got the captured attention of the group, but also we could easily do that at subsequent meetings, even through a motion brought forward.
And given that this committee only has a couple of meetings left, would my motion be along the lines, would it be reporting back here, or that such a study be included in the recommendations coming out of this process?
I think either are fair game, but I do know that back to things, we don't have to solve everything at this committee by the end of the year, but what we could come out is with a list of things that need to be taken further. And maybe the Committee of Adjustment study ends up over at the Planning and Housing Committee.
Yeah.
And it gets referred over there, but we could create the nucleus of the look.
Okay, I'm going to make it a motion, so if you want to stand, hold me down if anyone else,
Councillor Bailão?
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on two things. I think that there's some work that it's going on to study some of the Committee of Adjustment work, and for example, the kinds of variances, how to operate better. So there are some reviews. So I think it'd be helpful for staff to understand what some of the issues are that this committee would be interested in looking at. I just caution us that there's a difference between city governance and planning governance, and a lot of the things that Committee of Adjustment does and how they act, it comes from the Planning Act, not so much from what the city would like to do or not to do. So I think we need to balance this work in terms of that. But I think if there's any specific areas that the committee would like to do, I think we can send it, because there is some work that staff is undertaking.
Okay. I'll make some brief comments, and we'll probably end up standing this item down to give Councillor Carroll a chance to write the motion. But I will, of course, thank Professor Robinson for speaking to us and raising an issue that councillors here deal with all the time, but are difficult ones. And I think that there is something that is in there that strikes with me is the red flags that are raised around Committee of Adjustment or other processes. And I think about a conversation I had recently with somebody. They said, we're going to get 80 people to come out to the Committee of Adjustment. We're going to show them that we think it should be this way. And they were on the other side of an issue. And I reminded them that the committee is not political in nature. Council is somewhat, but the committee itself, you can bring 1,000 people to the committee and say, this is the way we think it should be, but they will go back to the principles that they operate under the Planning Act. And so that was really a difficult conversation, because the member of the public didn't understand that, and they felt very strongly that this was a forum to go and demonstrate how people feel. And it was a slightly different lens that the committee applies, and I gave them some thoughts on how to proceed and build an argument before the committee that would work. But it goes back to people, I think, are frustrated with the process or feel that they haven't been heard, and ultimately don't have confidence in the process because of that. And that's, as an elected representative, is a huge red flag. And I don't have a motion on it, but I hope there may be something built in the process that we can begin to overcome those type of red flags as they arise. And the other observation I'll make is, although the professor talked to us about the Committee of Adjustment, I can see us easily changing the words Committee of Adjustment to fence dispute, to parking pad discussion, to stop signs, to speed humps, to a whole bunch of other highly technical processes that interface with competing interests in the public that are eventually adjudicated upon by one certain body or another. And I think the learnings from one process could easily be applied to the other. There may be some modifications, as Councillor Bailão said. The Committee of Adjustment is governed by the Planning Act, and the stop sign is a community council process. But there are similarities as well in terms of how we consult with people and how we present technical information and policies that we work under, and then how we solicit public input into those decision-making processes. And I've got lots of governance thoughts and concerns around any of those particular activities, and I know many councillors do because we've lived through them all the time, and we've lived through community councils where people leave frustrated or sit there for hours at a time to voice their opinion on a certain matter. And at the end of the day, at least in my perspective, is not everybody may agree with the final outcome, but I see that as a win or a check mark if everybody understands that we went through the process, everyone had a chance to be considered, and that the decision was made fairly at the end of the day, results aside. So again, I'll thank the professor to come speak to us and for raising these matters. And I'm just going to check here with the clerks if we're going to make it here, if we have to stand down the item. Yep. Nancy's advised that we just need a quick moment here. Were there any other motions? Councillor Carroll?
I'm phrasing the motion in such a way that all we're doing is that it's a reminder placeholder. We're asking that this be part of whatever are the final recommendations coming out of this. So ultimately, because that's a big undertaking, so the council should decide whether or not they want to have it. I'm kind of intrigued by this idea because there is a lot of frustration in this process, both on our side and the community side, if we're choosing sides. These are the people. There are people who are so well-resourced that they never really interface with us at all except to pay their bill, and don't really care one way or another as long as the city hall is taking care of all the other people who aren't well-resourced. But they are the people of whom we ask the most financially, and when they come to make a small change on their owned property, because they're lucky enough to own property, that's where their opinion of us is formed, where we do a huge runaround. They don't really understand why they can't do what they can't do, or why it's up to these people and not us. They don't get a lot of understanding while they're being taken through the Committee of Adjustment meat grinder. And so I think it's worth looking at, and I think probably just as the Committee of Adjustment is designed to be impartial, the impartiality of saying, let's partner with one of our post-secondary institutes that we have these agreements with, one of the 3 planning schools, to do a look at it, apart from doing the look within these City Hall walls, to really look at, is there some different way to go about this or some way to improve it? I think we'd get a more academic, more impartial approach if we do exercise one of our partnerships and have the research done outside of City Hall. So I want that to be a recommendation, and then council can discuss it later on down the road.
Anyone else wishing to speak? Seeing none, we have the motion before us. Nancy, also, I guess we should also, I can move that we receive the presentation, or this is adequate, great. So the motion is before us. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that is carried. Thank you. We are now on to GV 3.2, Business Improvement Areas and Community Programs Response to Information Requests. There are 2 presentations, and the first one I'll welcome Mike Major from the BIA Office in Economic Development and Culture.
Good morning. I wonder if I could just say a few introductory remarks to the 2 presentations.
Thank you.
First, also to add my thanks to Dr. Pamela Robinson for coming, and to my 2 colleagues here today who will be providing some additional information. Some of you may know Dr. Robinson wrote a very timely and still relevant report from our last governance review on civic engagement as well, which we can certainly circulate to the committee members who might be interested in reading that. I know I pull it out often to refer to. Part of the reason why we're having these 2 presentations today is that over the last 2 committee meetings, a number of questions and comments have come up related to the relationship between the city's legislative governance processes, so its committees and council and boards, and the city's non-legislative processes such as community engagement, community supports and resources. And they've been raised over the last couple meetings. And in particular, speakers have noted that the city should consider additional supports to community and neighbourhood associations and organizations to support council's decision-making, so the relationship between these 2 components. Specific references were made by members of the public in our so far already surveys we've received, as well as in these committee meetings, to the Business Improvement Area Program and the city's community grants and community development programs. So this morning, staff from the BIA office are providing a bit of an overview of that program so we can better understand their objectives, their fundings, and their structure, as well as staff from SDF&A to provide an overview of the city's programs that support communities and community-based organizations. And I guess I would just end by saying that these are just two examples of ways in which city services and programs connecting with the public. And Chair had noted that the workbooks for the public consultation are here, and in there are a number of other types of ways in which we are engaging and building these relationships that sort of feed into the city's and council's citywide and local decision-making processes, which we're all interested in learning more about today. So I'm going to turn this over to Mike Major from the BIA office. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and give this overview. Some of you have been working with BIAs for many years, or so are well versed in this. Others may have just recently inherited a BIA from the merger of the wards, and some wards were still working on creating BIAs. Some of you may not know this, but BIAs are actually a Toronto invention. The first BIA in the world was established in Bloor West Village in 1970. So in 2020, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of BIAs. Since then, it's been replicated around the world, and all BIA models across the globe really take their basis from the Toronto model. Recently, a few years ago, I actually traveled to Jamaica on behalf of FCM and worked with the national government there to actually establish the first BIA legislation in that country. There are currently 82 BIAs across 18 wards in the City of Toronto. This trend is continuing. We continue to add 1 or 2 business improvement areas in the city. The core is quite well serviced by business improvement areas. I think what you will see in the future is there's a trend towards more industrial BIAs, starting with Emery Village, most recently Duke Heights, and we're currently looking at O'Connor-Bermondsey industrial area as well. We are also putting more focus on establishing BIAs outside the core in the former municipalities of Scarborough, North York, Etobicoke. What is a BIA? Well, it's an organization of business people entrusted to deliver services and programs that benefit the local community. They are established at the request of the local business community following consultations with their member businesses and formal city polling. I only raise this because it's not the City of Toronto that goes out and promotes BIAs and foists it on business communities. We really leave it up to the local community to decide for themselves whether they want to create a BIA. They are not managed by the City of Toronto. They are managed by a volunteer board elected from and by the local business community every 4 years, same as the term of council. They are self-funded. The City of Toronto does not provide money for operating the BIA operating budgets. They're self-funded through a levy based on property assessment. They are a board of the city and therefore are subject to code of conduct, MFIPA rules, and they are operated in accordance with Chapter 19 of the Municipal Code. What are some of the benefits of a business improvement area? Well, first, it provides that organizational structure that allows for long-range planning and program development. Without a BIA, there's no consistency in revitalization efforts that a community may undertake. It also provides the ability to generate significant financial resources to improve the area, provides organizational clout to influence change. It's not just one business member acting individually to complain to City Hall. You actually have a group to channel broader concerns to City Hall. Funds collected stay in the community. It's not as if the city keeps some of those funds. Everything that we collect on behalf of the BIA gets remitted back to the BIA. It does provide predictable annual funding that everyone contributes to. And you, as a BIA, you actually do get access to some city incentives, including facade improvement grants, the capital cost share program, and other grants. So what can BIAs do? Basically what they can and cannot do is set out in Chapter 19 of the Municipal Code. What they can do is basically anything that benefits the broader good and are in addition to services provided through general taxes. All right, so don't rely on the BIA to take over what is naturally a city responsibility, whether it's fixing potholes or collecting garbage. That's not the role of the BIA, but they can use their funds to supplement those services. So some of the things they do provide supplemental area maintenance, safety and security initiatives, improvements to the public sidewalk and other public lands. They can advertise, promote, plan festivals, those types of things. What can't BIAs do? Well, they cannot fund improvements to the benefit of individual properties or businesses. They are there to promote the broader community and not self-benefit. They cannot borrow or lend money, with the exception of borrowing money from the city, perhaps to fund a larger capital improvement project. They cannot incur indebtedness beyond the current fiscal year, so they can't bind future boards with debt. They cannot support political candidates or parties. They are politically neutral, so should not be engaging in politics. And they cannot, because they are city board, they can't take a position that's contrary to the City of Toronto. They can advocate as much as they like before council makes a decision. They can depute at committee, but once council makes a decision, they can't, for example, appeal that decision to the Ontario Municipal Board. Thanks, thank you. How do you establish a BIA? Well, the first step is to get a group of businesses together, interested businesses, and form a steering committee made up of local champions, if you will. Their job is to consult with their neighbors and to define the boundaries and to gauge if there's any interest in moving forward. If there is sufficient interest, the city will hold a formal public meeting with the area businesses on whether to move forward to a formal poll. And that would just be one meeting in the community with a simple yes or no vote to move forward or not. And it is a secret ballot. If that is a yes vote, we will report to council and recommend that the city clerk conduct a poll. It's a 60-day polling period. The city requires a minimum 30% response rate from the business community and 50% plus one positive response. These are actually stricter thresholds that apply than across the rest of Ontario, because under the City of Toronto Act, we can basically dictate how we run our BIAs. So we did institute sort of a higher threshold across in order to create a BIA. If it is a positive poll, we will report on those results to council. And council establishes the BIA. Important to note that once the BIA is established, everyone within that area is part of the BIA and subject to the levy. There is no opt-out provision. So basically, how does a BIA operate? Well, the general membership, that's everyone within the business community, are members of the BIA. It is their role to elect the board to every 4 years at an annual general meeting, and they must approve the activities and the budget for the BIA annually, and that gets reported to council. It's up to the Board of Management that's elected to actually run the day-to-day affairs of the BIA. They are elected by the membership but appointed by Community Council. Yes, so this is the number one question we usually get from the business community when we go out there to discuss a BIA is how much is it going to cost me? Well, it's not the city that dictates how much the BIA's budget should be. That's up to the Board of Management to put forward a budget to their membership. The membership considers that budget, can either adopt or amend it at the annual general meeting. Council then approves the budget. The special levy is applied to the tax bill. It is a separate line item on the tax bill, so members know exactly how much they're contributing in general taxes and how much towards the special BIA levy. City collects the funds and remits all those funds back to the BIA. Audited financial statements are prepared and required to be submitted to audit committee each year. How much an individual pays depends on 3 factors. One is the assessed value of the property, how much the BIA sets as a budget, and the total area assessment within that BIA. Who pays the levy? Well, we send the tax bill to the property owner. Our expectation is that the property owner would pay the BIA levy. However, in most cases, it's a flow through depending to the tenant, depending on your lease arrangements. We have no control over lease arrangements, but by and large, the BIA levy does get passed down to the tenants. If there's more than one tenant within a property, that BIA levy gets split amongst the tenants. So what do we do in the Toronto BIA office? Well, we provide professional advice and support to our 82 BIAs on a daily basis. We do provide legislative oversight, ensuring that BIAs are governed in accordance with the municipal code and other applicable city policies and bylaws. We provide issue management support to BIAs. We have a streetscape improvement cost share program that we fund and deliver. Any streetscape improvements a BIA may want to undertake, we split those costs 50-50 with the BIA. We administer facade improvement program grants, mural grants, streetscape master plan grants. Most recently, we developed capacity development grants that help sort of our needier BIAs with additional supports. There are BIAs like Downtown Yonge that are highly sophisticated and mature and require very little support, but there are some struggling BIAs that could benefit through additional capacity building support. We do have 6 economic partnership advisors that in our office to do that work, as well as 3 streetscape designers who deliver and implement capital projects. I just want to finish off by saying why are BIAs important? Well, Toronto's main streets and our independent small business sector are important attributes in the local economy and in the quality of life and neighborhood amenities it offers its residents. BIAs contribute about $40 million annually to help keep our main streets vital. That's money out of their own pocket to support their local neighborhoods. Having said that, main streets are fragile entities and require special attention. They are subject to boom and bust. The cycles, I've seen the beach BIA and many others go through a cycle where everything's going well, requiring little support, and then periods where it's not so good and there's lots of vacancies. I just want to highlight for your attention 3 major initiatives that are currently underway. One is our capacity building program in distressed retail areas. We are trying to, we see BIAs as a fundamental tool in helping revitalize an area. However, we recognize that some areas are not so well heeled and need some additional supports in order to get them going. And that's what our capacity building program is. We provide some area analysis for them, identifying their strengths, their weaknesses, perhaps putting an action plan forward for them. We provide some seed funding for them, and as well as our expectation is at some point they will become a BIA. And then once they move to that step, there's also early supports. We've had some success in this area in Oakwood Vaughan, where it was dormant BIA for many years. We went in there with a capacity building program, and now they're a well-functioning BIA. We also recently are in a polling process for Rogers Road, which is in another neighborhood improvement area. So we hope to have success there. We are also doing a comprehensive study of the future, the current state and future of retail in the City of Toronto, particular focus on independent retailers and how we save our Main Street retail areas as a place to do all your shopping. BIA should not just be areas where there's restaurants and bars. They need to provide the full range of services. Greengrocers, restaurants, all kinds of things. And we're seeing a trend away from that. We are planning on reporting on that early in 2020 with some possible programs to help our small independent retailers. We are also, we have major construction projects going on across the city. To a large extent, the business community bears a lot of the impacts from that construction. It's necessary construction, but there are perhaps some ways we can mitigate the impacts on businesses. Again, we plan on that study's underway, and we want to report back on that early in 2020. Interesting, one thing that's also on our radar screen is BIA 2.0. We have some very sophisticated, well-heeled BIAs out there. Downtown Yonge, Bloor Yorkville, Financial District. These BIAs are capable of undertaking more, perhaps working in partnership with the city. So we're looking at ways of expanding the role and impact that they can have on the city. So that is my presentation, and I'll take any questions you have.
Thank you. And if the committee pleases, given there's 2 presentations, I thought we would do questions for each. Are there any questions from the committee? Councillor Carroll.
Yeah. The governance system that you describe, it sounds like, you know, where things break down, it's largely due to whether the economy is in a boom or a bust. You've got a nice little governance model there that generally you can say works, give or take awkward personalities. The model is in place. There's a conversation going on broadly, because we're looking at governance, and I think it might have happened anyway, even without Bill 5, because you know we would have been in change mode anyway, change into the 47. And whenever we go through that change mode, people begin to talk about community council doesn't work. What about those community boards they have down south? What if they did more? What if the BIA and the residents had to interact more? Is there a danger to what is a pretty successful model right now if we said to them, okay, you're a BIA, but we now want you to be part of some other thing? Could we risk messing with this model if we said to a BIA board, you now also have to send representation and sit on some board with residents or appointees or something like that? Do we upset something?
So the state of our BIAs is healthy.
Yeah, in the current model.
When I talked about BIA 2.0, this is not in response to the city putting additional responsibility on them.
Right.
It's in response to them coming to us and saying, how can we help? So it's not a question of the city imposing.
For those bigger ones, though, there is a potential there, isn't there? If you look at monster BIAs sort of form in every city, because in the central business district, you can have those, like our financial one, which is now so big, it's kind of like Bryant Park BIA in New York City. And they do end up, they have over time, to do the bigger things, begun to work with resident partners outside of their business community. Is there capacity to do that in smaller groups, or is that really just the kind of thing that will happen in a downtown young BIA, where they start to work with the broader community because they need their approval to do something?
So realistically, I think.
Yeah, I'm looking for realism.
It's probably the larger, more well-heeled BIAs.
Yeah.
The smaller BIAs struggle to just deliver for their own community.
Right, so
good-
just running that governance model is enough for a small business.
I'll give you a good example, though, the safe injection site at downtown Yonge.
Right.
The downtown Yonge BIA actually approached the public health department on ways they could assist with dealing some of the externalities from that site, and
Yeah.
now have a squad that works with the public health department
Okay,
to deal with some of those externalities.
right, and that's possible because they're a larger, more well-resourced one, so they then can begin to work with city agencies. And in that case, they worked with the community too, I think, because there were people in the community, condo dwellers nearby who were also concerned.
That's right.
But you need that capacity.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's what I was looking for, some realism in that conversation.
Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Carroll. Any other questions? I had a couple. That's all right. Could you tell me, just in terms of dollars, is there an average or just a way for me to get my head wrapped around what a business might contribute to a BIA?
So in terms of BIA budgets, I wouldn't use an average. I'd look at tiers, perhaps. You have smaller BIAs where it's less than $100,000, depending on the size of the BIA and what they want to do. And then you get progressively moving upwards in budget, and you look at a downtown Yonge and Bloor Yorkville, they're about $2 million annually.
So what does that mean to the actual business? Is that a couple $100 a year or a couple of $1,000s a year?
So again, it varies. I'll give you an example. Gerard India Bazaar, they have a fairly healthy budget because they have a major festival they put on, but it's a very small area. So the businesses in that area actually have a probably relatively high levy rate. You got to collect the same pot of money from a smaller group. A place like the financial district that has a $2 million budget, it's pennies a square foot in terms of cost to the business members.
Could you comment a little bit on how the governance works? So the property owner pays the levy, if I've got that right from the presentation, and then how is the proxy or the vote then subdivided down to the actual business keepers or shopkeepers or owners that maybe collectively in a single property, or do they not have the same footing as the property owner at the BIA table?
So we send the tax bill to the property owner. In most cases, they're not actually paying the levy. They pass it on through their lease arrangements to the tenant. Regardless, the property owner and any tenant within that area have equal say and equal votes.
Okay.
The other thing to note, you may own 5 properties within a BIA, 1 vote.
Understood. And I guess the last question I had is, the BIAs to me seem as a tremendous opportunity, and I know they are. They're a great opportunity to connect with and consult with on the process when the city's developing policies. You know, you brought the safe injection sites, but I'm thinking of clothing drop boxes that we just dealt with. Single-use plastics is one. You know, there's an endless number of opportunities to check in with business owners in the city. But I also note in the presentation, there's a very distinct line that says that BIAs can't take a position contrary to the city. And maybe I wondered if you could explain to me a little bit about how that could work or unfold, or are we short in potential because of some of the rules around that? Because I would appreciate that if a BIA got together and made a position on a matter and then found themselves on the other side of council's decision on it, they're now in a difficult spot because they would be contrary, you know, before the final decision was made. And are we successful at the consultation process with BIAs, and is there opportunity for more, and in particular in the BIA 2.0 model?
So that's a great question. The city bureaucracy is very familiar with BIAs, so whenever they undertake an initiative, whether it's garbage fees or Boulevard Cafe bylaw changes, they now know that they need to consult with the business community, in particular BIAs and Tabia. So that's part of our role as well, is to ensure that the business community and BIAs are engaged in those processes, and that city staff are aware of BIAs and have the proper contact information to engage them.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Welcome, Costanza Olivera. You're Director of Community Resources from Social Development, Finance, and Administration. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, maybe you can bend the mic a little closer to you.
Okay, is that better? Okay, thank you. So this morning I'm going to speak about the community resources section of the SDFA, and our section focuses on building strong and inclusive communities, and we do that by developing and delivering integrated services that are responsive to local needs. We engage residents and other stakeholders to support neighborhood and community well-being. We collaborate with internal and external stakeholders to develop citywide and local strategies. We leverage efforts across city divisions and community agencies, and we build and leverage intergovernmental and community partnerships. So the community resources section has 5 units that really support community engagement and involvement. We have the Community Funding Unit, the Community Safety and Wellbeing Unit, the Tower and Neighborhood Revitalization, Community Development, and Youth Development Unit. Our Community Funding Unit has 2 key grant streams. They include the Community Services Partnership Grant, or CSP, and this grant is intended to create stability for the not-for-profit sector by providing ongoing funding. The other grant stream is the Community Investment Funding, and this is a short-term, one-time funding for special community initiatives. All grants are approved by council. In 2019, the budget for the Community Services Partnership was just over $17 million. And the budget for the short-term grants, the community investment, was just under $4 million. And in 2019, 187 agencies will receive Community Services Partnership allocations, ranging anywhere from $5,400 to over $643,000, with an average allocation of $90,000. And across the portfolio of agencies, every dollar of CSP funding is augmented by approximately $64 in revenue for the agencies from other sources. With respect to the short-term funding or the community investment, the allocations follow through in this manner. With respect to events, we allocate $425,000 to community agencies. For gun violence prevention, we allocate $1 million. For the crisis response grant, we have $130,000 that's allocated to community groups. We have a neighborhoods grant for $458,000 that goes to local residents. We have a capacity building grant of $1 million to help our not-for-profit sector organizations strengthen their capacity. And we have the Identify and Impact Youth grants at $245,000. Our Community Safety and Wellbeing Unit has 4 key programs. They have the Community Crisis Response Program, and this program responds to violence and traumatic incidences that happen across the city through 3 pillars of intervention, prevention, and preparation. And for the last 3 years, our staff have responded to 552 incidences in 2016, 604 incidences in 2017, and 664 incidences in 2018. And as of May 17, 2019, staff have responded to 220 violent or critical incidences in the city. Some of the key initiatives of the Community Crisis Response Program include the Mayor's Safety Award, and this award honors and recognizes residents and organizations for their contribution to improving safety across the city. And also the Community Safety Network Forum, and this brings together members of 24 community safety networks across the city to tackle issues of community violence and also to discuss safety as a social determinant of health. A key resource for communities is the Community Crisis Response Fund, which I spoke about earlier, and this fund supports communities in their healing process after experiencing a violent and traumatic incident. Another program is the Specialized Program for Interdivisional Enhanced Response to Vulnerability, and we like to call it the SPIDER program. And this is a working table that consists of decision makers from city divisions and community agencies, including police services, and it works to reduce the recurrence of complex health and safety risks and ensure safe integration and inclusion of vulnerable Torontonians back into their neighborhoods and communities. And the table deals with the situations that are so complex and have a serious impact on the individual as well as the community that no one agency can resolve the issue on their own. And from 2014 to 2019, the table has resolved 209 very complex cases. And the top services that were activated by the table included mental health crisis support, support with respect to lack of housing, case management for services, and hoarding support. And a key initiative of this area, this program, is the Open Dialogue. And these are free workshops on topics that help to support the understanding of work with vulnerable populations. And annually, my staff hold open dialogues. They hold 8 sessions, and they hold about 100 workshops and events to bring awareness to issues of vulnerability, such as hoarding, hospitalization and discharge planning, neurodevelopmental disabilities, and so on. And to date, the team has engaged over 4,000 residents and community partners around these trainings. Another program is Furthering Our Communities by Uniting Services, FOCUS, and this is an initiative co-led by the City, the United Way, and Toronto Police Services. And its aim is to reduce crime, victimization, and also to improve community resiliency and well-being. And the model builds off the lessons learned through our community crisis program. And currently, focus tables are located in Police Divisions 14, 23, 42, and 51. And these tables bring together the city, police, community partners to discuss and resolve specific situations in order to prevent violence from occurring or escalating. And in 2018, 624 situations were reviewed at the tables, and their risk was lowered or eliminated in 80% of the situations as a result of the table's involvement. To date, 267 cases have been closed and resolved by all 4 tables. Other municipalities also use FOCUS across the province, and the busiest FOCUS table in the province is located in the downtown east in Toronto. And the top 4 issues that come to the table relate to lack of housing, mental health issues, and antisocial behavior. The other initiative is the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan. And this year, the provincial government has legislated that all municipalities are to develop and adopt community safety and well-being plans. The legislation requires the city to work in partnership with a multi-sectoral advisory committee that's comprised of representatives from the Police Services Board and other local service providers. Municipalities have 2 years, as of January 2019, to develop and approve the plans. The work that our division is already doing through Community Crisis Response Program and FOCUS will help inform the development of the plan. Also, our work with the Ministry of the Attorney General in the development and support of community justice centres in Rexdale and the downtown east communities will also help to inform that plan. And the plan will go to Council for approval in 2020. The other unit is the Tower and Neighbourhood Revitalization Unit, and that group leads a series of programs that drive broad environmental, social, economic, and cultural change by improving Toronto's older apartment tower communities and neighbourhoods across the city. Tower and Neighbourhood Revitalization, or TNR, works in collaboration with many divisions such as planning, public health, solid waste, as well as with external partners such as community agencies, landlords, property management companies, property owners, and residents to improve conditions for residents in towers and neighbourhood revitalization areas. And in the picture, this is a site of a tower mural project at 4010 Lawrence Avenue East. This is a beautification project that was conducted in collaboration with our public realm staff, as well as with the property owner and residents and other agencies. So the TNR, there are 4 areas of focus. The first is tower renewal, and this focuses on the improvement of over 1,000 older apartment buildings that are home to over 500,000 people in the city. The tower renewal offers site improvement guidance and implementation supports such as financing, leveraging investments and programming in tower communities. So for example, over 300 buildings have been assessed for environmental and social well-being. $10 million has been allocated in retrofit financing as of June 2019. 400-plus sites were rezoned by the city to permit community-oriented uses and services through the residential apartment, commercial, or RAC zoning. And 7 communities for Recipe for Community, a grant through the Toronto Community Foundation of $100,000 per year for a total of $700,000 in investment in these neighborhoods. The other program is the city's community space tenancy program, where the city leases its spaces to eligible not-for-profit organizations to deliver needed services to residents at below-market rents. And this allows the city to maximize the use of city assets, and it also allows for more services to be offered to residents at either free or low cost. The Tower Neighborhood Revitalization Unit also supports community hub development, such as the George Street revitalization, as well as small-scale local community hubs. And to date, our staff are working on 15 community hub developments that are at different stages of development. TNR also supports communities going through change through the development of action plans like the Downtown East Action Plan, as well as developing social development plans for Toronto community housing revitalization areas, such as the social development plans for Regent Park, Lawrence Heights, and Alexander Park. The other unit is the Community Development Unit. And this unit has staff on the ground leading the implementation of the social development plans. They work with residents, the city divisions, and community partners to achieve the plan's outcomes. The unit is also responsible for implementing the Toronto Strong Neighbourhood Strategy across all of the city's neighbourhoods, but with a focus on working on the city's 31 neighbourhood improvement areas. And the objective of the strategy is to improve neighborhood well-being by activating residents and community organizations, activating resources, and activating neighborhood-friendly policies. There are 16 neighborhood planning tables representing 31 NIAs, and each of these tables has developed an action plan that identifies the priorities for each of the communities with respect to strategies towards neighborhood well-being. And to help activate resources, Council approved $12 million as part of the Toronto Strong Neighbourhood Strategy in POLE funding, or Partnership Opportunities and Legacy Funding, in order to create or enhance community spaces in city-owned or leased properties. And the $12 million has been fully allocated to 37 projects that include projects such as splash pads, community rooms, playground improvements, sports pads, and much more. The team also works with a variety of resident advisory groups, including the Toronto Seniors Forum and the Resident Advisory Committee for the Toronto Strong Neighbourhood Strategy. Now, the Youth Development Unit, they focus on youth aged 13 to 29 years of age. They have a number of programs and plans, including the Toronto Youth Partnership and Engagement Program. This is an employment program that focuses on vulnerable and marginalized youth, and through a mobile case management approach, they connect youth to education, training, or employment. The other is the Toronto Youth Job Corps, and this is a cost-shared program with the federal government for about $11 million over 3 years. And this provides training to youth as well as paid placed employment. And together, these programs have connected in 2018 over 6,000 youth to employment opportunities, and over 1,500 youth found employment through these programs. The other is the Youth Violence Prevention Plan, and this staff are working with youth as well as community agencies to identify strategies to help mitigate and eliminate youth violence. And this plan will also help to inform the city's community safety and well-being plan. The other strategy is the Toronto Youth Equity Strategy. This was adopted in 2014 by Council. This has led to a number of expansion in city programs for youth, including youth spaces, shelters for youth. It's also led to the first pre-charge diversion program for youth in the city that's being offered in conjunction with the police and community partners. Also, as directed by Council, staff are working with the transgender and non-binary community to develop a transgender and non-binary youth service plan. The purpose of the plan is to increase access to city services by transgender and non-binary youth. And we hope to come to Council with a report in 2020. The Community Healing Project, this was a pilot through the Toronto Youth Equity Strategy, and this year we received $6.5 million over 5 years from the federal government to expand the project across the city. This is a train the trainer program to help communities heal and recover from violence and trauma in their communities. And the other is services for youth on probation, parole, and remand. This is, again, part of the Youth Equity Strategy. We received an additional $2.5 million from Council as part of the 2019 budget, and so we will be expanding these programs. So in terms of sort of facts, stats, and trends, SDFA focuses on supporting Toronto's vulnerable and equity-seeking population. We support 31 NIAs, as well as communities in distress. In 2018, as mentioned, our staff responded to over 250 violent and traumatic incidences in communities, including the incident in North York and the Danforth. Staff have led and will continue to lead the work on transforming the Toronto community housing, and we administer the city's 7 community grant programs, and there are 346 recipients. So some of the trends we're seeing is that we're seeing a growing income and social inequality in the city. We're seeing an increase in gun violence and also the sort of the type of guns that are being used and access to guns. And we're also seeing continued barriers to employment and social inclusion for equity-seeking groups. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the committee? Councillor Carroll.
Yeah, it's a question I'd probably be asking at any time, but especially in the context of Bill 108. I have a large ward where there's poverty, but there are no neighborhood improvement areas. I haven't had sour grapes, though, because I'm a growth area. And so, we're able to mitigate using that. So I haven't had a lot of access to tower neighborhood revitalization programs, and indeed even some of the youth programs. But under Bill 108, things are going to change. We're not going to get as much as we used to get for growth. Growth is going to stop paying for growth. How do we adapt so that programs like this do get spread around? Because the neighborhood improvement areas that are designated tended to be the ones that aren't in areas where you can count on growth to make change. But there are areas like the peanut in my case that are near growth, and that's the only reason, or the main reason they weren't designated back in the day. Is there the beginning of a look at how do we address gaps there after we're now at 15 years or so of having a place-based strategy?
Well, we're actually doing an evaluation of our Toronto Strong Neighbourhood Strategy. We're going out to the community, to our partners, and we will be reporting back to Council in 2020 on the strategy and going forward. So that will be part of the consideration. One of the things we've noticed is that it's not only, we're involved not only in neighbourhood improvement areas, we're often called to participate and to support community communities that are not NIAs. So, for example...
Oh, so you would have some data about what goes on there as well?
Well, we have some data, yes. So, for example, in the Oakwood Vaughan community, which is not an NIA, they were experiencing some issues in that neighborhood. So we participated with the community, and the community was really interested in the model of the NIA. And they have formed a neighborhood improvement planning table themselves. We do provide support. There are city divisions, community partners, residents, but it is not an NIA that has adopted that model. So in our sort of evaluation of Toronto Strong Neighborhood Strategy, we're going to be looking at, how do we move this strategy forward given the new conditions and the trends that we're seeing in the city.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I had a couple. And I think you just touched on some of the answers. So the Toronto Strong Neighborhood Strategy, is that going to look again at the definition of NIAs and where they are? Is that as far as it's going to go? I mean, maybe the broad question is what is the process for us to continuously review where the neighborhood improvement areas are? I've got some pockets as well, like Councillor Carroll, that I shouldn't say pockets, neighborhoods that struggle but aren't in the definition of NIA. And how do I get them access to some of the resources that are available in other places? And will the next review of this give them an opportunity to be looked at?
Actually, we are in the process and are undertaking a review of two things. One is the implementation of the strategy itself. Did we achieve what we set out to achieve? So we're consulting, as I mentioned, with residents and community partners. What do we need to do? What can we do better? And what are some of the challenges that we need to address in the future going forward? The other piece is actually to do the analysis of the reanalysis of the demographics that we did originally with the strategy. So we have our research staff that are starting to compile data to see what is happening in our neighborhood. So we will also be reporting out on that. So that'll help to address, where are some of the issues and challenges across the city. Do we need to change some of the NIAs, or is it just an extension? Because all neighborhoods, we're concerned about all well-being for all neighborhoods. So, okay.
Follow-on question to that, and in particular out in Etobicoke, where I am, it's a completely different fabric of the city, and one of the overlays that I use when trying to understand connectivity and access to services is to plot out transit routes. And I wondered if your review of the neighborhoods or any of your reviews will have that overlay. People don't have universal access to private motor vehicles, for instance. I've actually just recently seen some really interesting data from Uber about how people are moving around using that service. One of the surprises to me was one of the top 5 destinations out in my area. 4 of them were transit stations, and one of them was a grocery store, which was really interesting. But just, is there a way to overlay the mobility corridors that really coalesce around bus routes and how people connect to city services or other services, and what are the gaps and things that are missing? And if you have to take your kids to a walk-in clinic, taking 4 buses in the winter with 3 transfers is just not doable. So how do we insert that lens into the study work that we're doing?
Well, Councillor, I'll certainly bring that back to our research team as another lens to sort of identifying where there are gaps in neighborhoods. The other thing we will be looking at is, as I mentioned, each of the tables has sort of action plans, or what are their priorities in terms of well-being. So we will be looking at what are the sort of priorities for these neighborhoods and sort of digging deeper in terms of what are some of the challenges, what are some of the interventions that are required.
I guess the last question I have is a little different. And you reinforced it today, we actually have a lot of opportunities, a lot of grants, and a lot of programs for people to make a difference. And I come across this all the time, members of the community that are quite active, quite well-connected, and are quite eager to do things to improve situations or to make a difference in people's lives and to meet a lot of the objectives. But one of the things they don't have is really good experience writing grants. I can just think of a soccer team that I just encountered, and they're struggling. How do you get the documentation in? What are the deadlines? What are the types of things that the city needs from me? Where do I go to learn how to write a grant better? Because I'm convinced if they could just handle that hurdle or get some experience in that hurdle, they would be off to a really successful program. Are there workshops in the city, or are there specialists or resources I could point them to say, you got great ideas, why don't you talk to somebody here and they can help you put it all together? It's almost like forming a business plan and going to get a loan, right? There is that step that is a challenge to somebody that hasn't done it before.
So, Councillor, often when we launch our grants, our staff do have clinics and invite applicants to come in, and they provide support with respect to grant writing. The City of Toronto isn't the only grant provider, and there are a lot of other funders that also provide workshops. In addition, our Community Capacity Grant, which is a new grant for this year. This will help address some of those issues and help build capacity in sort of newer or more emerging organizations in terms of helping them grant writing, governance, and different issues. So you can refer them to us. We do provide that kind of support, and so do other funders.
All right, I'm going to do my point in the form of a question, but I just wondered if you had seen the grants application process as part of a broader civic engagement window that we have spent a lot of time at the committee talking about the various ways that people connect with their city, and wondered if you saw the grants process as one of those and integral.
Absolutely, and our grants have sort of shifted and really reflected that. In fact, our neighborhood improvement tables, grants, whenever there's a grant, it's raised at those tables. We've got the community capacity building grant, we've got the neighborhood grants. So there's a lot of grants to support the emerging groups and organizations, and that's why we have the community investment sort of component to focus and target on that type of activity.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Thank you very much for joining us today and for your presentation. I'll also take a moment. There are no registered speakers for this, and I will ask if there are any members of the public that wish to speak to this item. Seeing none, thank you. Are there any members of the committee wishing to speak to this item? Seeing none, Councillor Carroll, please.
Just a quick word of the two presentations, just to note that one of the things that keeps coming up, I was asking Mr. Major about what if the BIAs were asked to join something else, because it keeps coming up in the community. And I briefly attended your area's consultation last night, and it came up with a community member that I was talking to. First of all, she's frustrated with the boundaries because she was looking forward to the map of 47, and so she's still bitter about that one. And I guess because of the court case, it was on her mind. But
I thought you were going to say she wanted to be in my ward.
as a matter of fact, yes, exactly. But the other thing that came up with that resident and another is people are still talking about this. What could we do, and how could we have something that does more than what community councils do? And what about these models that kept being quoted to us? And they were quoted to us by the provincial government. They were doing Bill 5. Oh, you'll be fine. You can have neighborhood councils or community boards. It's another one of those things that I don't think this committee, if it sticks to its timeline, can possibly tackle. Because the reason I asked Mr. Major's questions is we have a very successful model there that we could, in proceeding in some fashion on something that people sort of vaguely understand is going on in some other city and we haven't properly researched it, we could end up torpedoing the success of a very successful model there by asking them to take on this whole other responsibility. So I just flag it out there that that's why I was asking those questions. Is it working? Is it our professional staff's opinion that they could suddenly take on this additional governance responsibility? And the answer was, realistically, in about 3 cases out of 82, maybe. So I think we've got to carry that with us to the discussion, because in the resident community, I don't think they're aware of that being a successful model, but it has a very specific job to do, and it's not really tooled in the case of a small BIA like Gerard, India, Bazaar, to suddenly become a community board that works with a whole range of agencies and community members and makes bigger social decisions. They're not really tooled up for that. Okay.
Thank you very much. May I take a motion to receive the reports? Councillor Carroll. All those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried. That is our last item of business, and therefore we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.